The Grand Council Chamber of the Galactic Empire was a marvel of engineering, an expansive hall suspended in the void of space, its walls lined with crystalline panels that displayed the shifting nebulae beyond. 1,000 delegates from 100 species filled the chamber, their voices a low murmur of anticipation. At the center of it all, seated upon his towering obsidian throne, was Supreme Chancellor Xylox, a creature of serpentine grace and too many eyes, each one alight with smug amusement. They were gathered for an amusing matter, one that had rippled through the Galactic Empire's upper echelons for months now. Humans. The upstart species from Sol 3, the supposed anomaly among the stars, had been causing quite a stir with their refusal to engage in war. The Empire had made multiple provocations, small skirmishes along their colonies, territorial disputes, accidental fleet incursions, and still, humanity had not declared war. They postured, they threatened, but no action was taken. To the Empire, it was a sign of cowardice, proof that humanity lacked the spine to stand among the great warrior civilizations. The Supreme Chancellor allowed his laughter to resonate, a layered, melodious chime that carried across the chamber. And so, he announced, gesturing with a flourish of his elongated fingers, we must entertain the question, do humans understand war at all? Or have they been coddled by their primitive indulgences for so long that the very thought of combat sent them into a panic? Chuckles rippled through the chamber, a chorus of alien voices expressing their collective amusement. Indeed, Supreme Chancellor, chimed in General Verrock, a battle-hardened veteran whose exoskeletal plates clinked together as he moved. We have seen their transmissions. Their people are obsessed with trivial distractions. They waste their time watching moving images of fictitious warriors rather than engaging in true battle. A species that reveres fictional strength while cowering from real war? Preposterous. His mandibles clacked in irritation. A different voice interjected, this one softer, more hesitant. Ambassador KLYTH, a junior diplomat, raised a thin appendage. Yet, Supreme Chancellor, I feel compelled to mention a curiosity. A pause. Despite their so-called cowardice, humanity's history is riddled with conflict. Their archives speak of endless wars, conquests, revolutions. In their primitive era, they even developed nuclear arms before mastering space travel. Xylox gave an indulgent smile. Yes, but that was then. You must understand, dear KLYTH, that war is a skill, and skills wither without practice. Humanity has softened, evolved beyond its savage nature, much like the primitive beasts of our own past who were culled by progress. This is a new humanity, one that has become too comfortable, too distracted by its own entertainment. More laughter, some approving murmurs. A few of the younger delegates nudged each other, whispering jokes about humanity's apparent weakness. There was a disturbance at the chamber entrance. The heavy, engraved doors slid apart with a mechanical hiss, revealing a lone human figure stepping forward with measured confidence. Ambassador Ryan Reynolds had the look of a man who had long since abandoned any illusion that diplomacy was about fairness. He adjusted the lapels of his neatly pressed uniform, exuding an air of weary amusement as he approached the council. His salt and pepper hair was cut short, his features lined with experience, yet there was something sharp in his eyes, something that didn't quite match the Empire's assumptions about human fragility. He stopped before the Supreme Chancellor's throne and gave a slow, deliberate smile. I'm here to inform you that your analysis of humanity, Ryan said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, is dangerously flawed. The chamber, once filled with laughter, hushed. Xylox leaned forward, his many eyes twinkling with amusement. Ah, our esteemed human diplomat. Tell us, do you bring yet another plea for peace? Ryan sighed, shaking his head. See, this is the problem. You all think you understand us. You watch our media, intercept our communications, and come to conclusions based on what? A few intercepted transmissions of people debating war? News headlines? Political speeches? He chuckled dryly. You don't understand humanity. Not even a little. General Verrock clicked his mandibles. Enlighten us then, human. What have we misunderstood? Ryan clasped his hands behind his back, tilting his head slightly. You assume that because we hesitate to go to war, we fear war. You think because we negotiate we are weak. But let me ask you something. His gaze swept over the assembly, lingering on the Supreme Chancellor. Have you ever seen a cornered human? Silence. A ripple of unease shifted through the council. Ryan's voice dropped lower, his tone conversational yet laced with something darker. You mock us for watching war movies, but you didn't stop to watch them yourselves, did you? If you had, you'd realize something. The heroes of those stories? They're never the ones looking for a fight. He took a slow step forward. They're the ones dragged into it. The ones who try to talk their way out, who avoid unnecessary conflict until someone pushes them too far. The council chamber felt colder now. Xylox's smile had tightened just a fraction. Ryan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You all laugh because you think we don't have the stomach for war. Because we sit back, enjoy our comforts, and don't fling ourselves into every conflict like mindless berserkers. He gestured vaguely. And yeah, we do love our distractions, our movies, our music, our games. But those aren't signs of weakness. His eyes locked onto the Supreme Chancellor's. They're what we hold onto so we don't become monsters again. Xylox's many fingers tapped against the armrest of his throne. And yet, here you are, pleading for peace. Ryan's grin returned, sharper now. I'm not here to plead for anything, Supreme Chancellor. I'm here to warn you. A hush fell over the chamber. Ryan rolled his shoulders back, his expression unreadable. There's a man back on Earth, General Alexander Mason. Iron Fist Mason, they call him. He's got a simple way of looking at things. He believes that if you have to fight, you fight so hard the enemy never thinks about fighting you again. Several delegates shifted in their seats. Xylox's expression was unreadable. Ryan's smile widened just slightly. You all wanted to know if humans fear war. His voice lowered. Well, congratulations, you're about to find out. With that, he turned on his heel and strode back toward the chamber doors, his posture radiating the quiet confidence of a man who knew what was coming. Behind him, the council sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, one of the younger aides, small, pale, and wide-eyed, muttered the question no one wanted to ask. Do we actually know how humans fight? And for the first time, the Supreme Chancellor had no answer. The war room beneath the Earth's surface was devoid of unnecessary decoration. It was a space of pure function, illuminated by the cold glow of tactical holograms and data streams. High-ranking military officials sat in grim silence, their faces cast in blue light as they observed the flickering projections of fleet formations, intercepted alien transmissions, and most importantly, the message from the Galactic Empire's Council. It played on repeat, their laughter echoing through the chamber like the taunting jeers of fools who had yet to realize they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Ryan Reynolds had heard it enough times. He let it play one last time before slamming the console and cutting the feed. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. At the far end of the room, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, was General Alexander Mason. He did not speak right away. His gaze, steel gray and unyielding, remained locked onto the now blank screen. The air around him was taut with something unspoken, something lethal. He was not a man given to wasted motion or unnecessary speech. He had the look of a relic, broad-shouldered, solid, a man who had seen war up close and never once flinched from its horrors. His uniform, crisp but well-worn, bore no unnecessary medals. He didn't need them. His reputation had long since outgrown such trivialities. Ryan exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. Well, I gave them fair warning. Mason finally moved, rolling a cigar between his fingers before biting off the tip with slow deliberation. And his voice was the kind that carried weight even at a whisper. Ryan leaned back against the console, and they laughed in my face. The general's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something colder. He struck a match against the steel edge of the table, the flame briefly illuminating the deep lines of his face before he lit the cigar and took a slow drag. Smoke curled from his lips, twisting in the artificial light like the prelude to something inevitable. They think we won't fight, Ryan continued, shaking his head. They think because we hesitate, we're afraid. They don't understand what that means. Mason exhaled, the smoke drifting lazily through the air before dispersing. Then let's educate them. The room tensed. Admiral Kensington, a woman whose presence was as commanding as her perfectly pressed uniform, folded her arms. Sir, are we certain about this? We haven't launched an offensive war in decades. Mason turned his gaze on her, his expression unreadable. We didn't start this. They did. She hesitated. They've been pushing us, yes, but they declared war the moment they thought we wouldn't fight back. Mason interrupted. His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it, a blade honed to a fine point. They see our hesitation as weakness. That's a mistake they won't live long enough to make twice. The tactical officer to his right cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. We're still analyzing their military capabilities, but based on what we know, their fleet outnumbers are significantly. Their technology is advanced. Mason took another slow drag from his cigar. Numbers don't win wars. Will does. Ryan, watching the exchange, smirked slightly. He knew that look in Mason's eyes. It was the look of a man who had already decided the outcome. He was simply waiting for the universe to catch up. They're about to learn, Mason said, his voice dropping to something quieter, something final. We don't fear war. We're just very, very good at it. The room was silent for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of what had just been decided. Then, one by one, the officers began moving. Orders were issued, commands relayed. Across the planet, the silent machine of Earth's military began to awaken from its long dormancy. Mason turned away from the table, stepping toward the exit. Ryan fell into step beside him. So, Ryan said, what's the plan? We going full shock and awe. Mason chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. We're going to make them regret ever looking in our direction. The hallway they stepped into was lined with reinforced steel, the distant hum of machinery underscoring their footsteps. Ryan glanced sideways at the general, taking in the way his fingers flexed unconsciously, the way his expression never wavered from that cold certainty. Tell me, Ryan said, you ever heard of the term overkill? Mason didn't look at him as he responded. No such thing. Ryan snorted. Figures. The lift doors hissed open, revealing the sprawling underground complex where humanity's greatest weapons were being prepared. Rows upon rows of mechanized war machines, sleek fighter craft, and the towering forms of orbital assault carriers. Engineers moved with relentless precision. Pilots ran drills with unerring focus. There was no chaos, no hesitation, only purpose. Mason took it all in with the air of a man surveying his tools before setting to work. First strike needs to be clean, he murmured. Decisive. We cut their comms, disrupt their fleet coordination, and cripple their supply chains before they know what hit them. Ryan whistled, going straight for throat. Huh? Mason's gaze didn't waver. There's only one way to win a war. Ryan arched a brow. Fast. Mason's lips twitched slightly. Completely. They moved further into the facility, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. This was no grand declaration of war, no pompous display of bravado. This was something colder, sharper. This was the steady march toward inevitability. Ryan watched as Mason came to a stop before the command center, where the final details were being arranged. He studied the man's profile, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his hands curled into loose fists. There was no hesitation in him, no second-guessing. He was the kind of man who had made peace with war a long time ago. Ryan exhaled. You really think they have no idea what's coming? Mason finally looked at him. There was something in his gaze, something quiet and certain. They have no idea what's coming. The weight of those words settled between them like a final, unshakable truth. And somewhere across the vast emptiness of space, the Galactic Empire continued to laugh. They wouldn't be laughing for long. The Supreme Chancellor's many eyes twitched as he watched the battle footage loop for the 7th time. He refused to believe it. This had to be some kind of mistake. The calculations, the intelligence reports, the decades of analysis, it all told a different story. Humanity was supposed to be cautious, unprepared, unwilling to fight. And yet here, in brutal, unrelenting clarity, was proof that they were none of those things. The Galactic Empire's fleets, vast, technologically superior, reinforced with centuries of accumulated military doctrine, were being torn apart. And not through sheer numbers, not through overwhelming firepower, but through something far worse: tactics. The humans fought like no species the Empire had ever encountered. They did not engage in grand displays of firepower, nor did they adhere to predictable patterns of battle. Their attacks were surgical, precise, devastating. Entire squadrons disappeared before they even knew they were under assault. Supply lines collapsed overnight. Orbital stations, meant to hold against full-scale sieges, were rendered useless in mere hours. Their systems had been high-reined, their communications jammed, their fleets unable to coordinate. And when the actual combat began, it was not a battle. It was a massacre. The War Council chamber was filled with a nervous energy, the usual air of superiority and smug confidence having evaporated entirely. Admirals fidgeted. Bureaucrats whispered in hushed tones, and planetary governors sent desperate pleas for reinforcement. Reinforcements they could not spare. The humans had seen to that. General Vierock, one of the Empire's most decorated war commanders, sat with his mandibles clenched so tightly they quivered. His exoskeletal fingers tapped against the polished stone of the war table as he struggled to formulate a response to the sheer absurdity of what he had witnessed. "The reports must be falsified," one of the younger admirals muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are not falsified," Vierock growled, slamming a fist against the table. The impact echoed through the chamber, and the young admiral visibly paled. "You think I do not wish they were lies? That this is some elaborate deception? But no. The humans have done exactly what we feared, exactly what the Supreme Chancellor assured us they were incapable of." His mandibles clicked with frustration. "They are fighting us. And they are winning." The room fell into a heavy silence. Ambassador Kale YTH, who had been watching all of this unfold with growing horror, hesitated before speaking. How could we have been so wrong?" His voice was quiet, almost lost amid the tension. "We studied them. We analyzed them. Every indicator pointed to a species that had abandoned war." Vierock exhaled sharply. "Because we did not study their actions. We studied their words." His gaze darkened. "And words are the refuge of those who still have the luxury of peace." The chamber doors slammed open with a mechanical hiss, and Supreme Chancellor Zylock strode in, his usually pristine robes slightly disheveled, his expression unreadable. His many eyes darted across the gathered officials before he came to a stop at the head of the war table. He did not sit. Instead, he placed his many hands on the surface and leaned forward, the eerie light of the holographic projections casting shifting shadows across his face. "We will not be afraid," he said, his voice cold, measured. "We are the Galactic Empire. We have ruled for centuries. We have crushed rebellions, ended dynasties, and brought entire civilizations to their knees." He straightened, eyes narrowing. "We will not be defeated by a species that spends its leisure time watching fictional stories of war." A murmur of agreement, though weak, rippled through the chamber. Zylox turned to his military commanders. "Deploy the second and third fleets. Engage the humans directly. Overwhelm them with superior numbers. End this before it escalates further." A long pause. Then, finally, Vierock spoke. His voice was tight. "The second and third fleets are gone." Zylock stilled. "Elaborate." The general's throat clicked. "They were intercepted before reaching their designated deployment zones. Communications went dark 20 hours ago. No distress signals, no final transmissions. Just silence." The Supreme Chancellor's expression remained unreadable, but the air in the chamber shifted. Something cold coiled around them, something that had never before existed in this council chamber. Fear. "They cannot simply erase fleets of that size," Zylock said slowly, his voice quieter now. "It is impossible." "Impossible." Vierock let out a hollow laugh, his mandibles twitching. Supreme Chancellor, with all due respect, the humans have made a career out of making the impossible look easy. Another uneasy silence followed, until finally a nervous communications officer stepped forward, his uniform slightly rumpled, as though he had run straight from his station. Supreme Chancellor, the officer stammered, there has been a development. Xylox exhaled sharply. Spit it out. The officer swallowed. Human forces have reached the capital's outer defense lines. Dead silence. And then, that's not possible. One of the admirals shot to his feet. No force has ever penetrated the Empire's core sectors. How could they? We don't know, the officer interrupted, his voice shaking. There were no alarms. No detected fleet movements. One moment, the defense network was operational. The next, they were inside our space. Xylox's many eyes widened, his composure cracking ever so slightly. Then what do they want? The officer hesitated. Then, trembling, he activated a transmission. A holographic screen flickered to life in the center of the chamber. And there, standing in the dim glow of a warship's command deck, was a face that had haunted every intercepted human military report. General Alexander Mason. He was not seated. He was standing, relaxed, as though he had all the time in the world. A faint glow of battle readiness shimmered behind him, distant lights flickering from the movement of warships in formation. Xylox straightened, regaining his composure, and took a step forward. General Mason, he said, voice regaining its authoritative weight. This war. Mason raised a hand, and Xylox stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Mason exhaled, rolling his shoulders. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried through the chamber with absolute clarity. I don't like wasting time, he said. So here's how this is going to go. You're going to surrender. Right now. Xylox stiffened. You are in no position to dictate. Mason continued as though he hadn't heard. You're going to step down. You're going to disband your fleets. You're going to accept every single one of our terms. And if you don't, a pause. Then, slowly, Mason leaned forward, just enough for the hollow projectors to catch the cold glint in his eyes. Then I stopped playing nice. The chamber held its breath. No threats. No long-winded speeches. Just a simple, undeniable fact. Xylox had never known what it felt like to be truly powerless. Until now. The screen flickered out, leaving only silence in its wake. And in that silence, for the first time in the history of the Galactic Empire, the Supreme Chancellor of the known universe hesitated. Because in that moment, in the darkness of his war chamber, he finally understood what the humans had always known. War was not about power. It was about the will to win. The silence in the war chamber stretched unbearably, thick with something alien to the Galactic Empire, something they had never encountered before. Dread. The Supreme Chancellor stood motionless, his many hands clenched so tightly against the cold metal of the war table that the engraved insignia beneath them began to crack. His countless eyes remained fixed on the darkened screen where General Alexander Mason's image had just flickered out, the ghost of his final words still lingering in the stagnant air. The War Council was frozen, every official, every admiral, every bureaucrat caught in the suffocating realization that this was no longer about strategy, no longer about tactics. This was survival. One of the junior ministers, his voice trembling, broke the silence. We cannot surrender. It would be silence. Xylox's voice was hoarse, the usual self-assured resonance reduced to something closer to a whisper. He did not look at the minister. He did not look at anyone. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the war table's projection, on the steady, merciless advance of the human fleet. The numbers didn't lie. Every last defense they had erected, every countermeasure, every contingency had been shredded apart. Entire fleets had disappeared. Entire legions of warriors, the best the Empire had to offer, had fallen without so much as a single distress signal. The humans hadn't fought like conquerors. They had fought like something far worse, like a species that didn't care about glory, like a species that only cared about winning. Xylox swallowed, a motion that sent a ripple of unease through the chamber. He had ruled for centuries, presided over wars that had spanned generations. He had crushed revolutions, had seen civilizations broken beneath the empire's heel. But this was different. General Varrock, his usual air of rigid confidence nowhere to be found, exhaled slowly, his mandibles twitching. They will not stop. Xylox finally turned to face him. They have no demands for territory, Varrock continued, voice low grim. No requests for resources. They did not come here to conquer. His exoskeletal fingers flexed in quiet unease. They came here to end us. The weight of those words settled heavily over the chamber. A quiet cough broke the silence. It was Ambassador Galactic. His usual nervous energy was now accompanied by something sharper, something desperate. He turned his gaze toward Xylox, and for the first time, there was no deference there. No fear, just exhaustion. We pushed them, Galactic said, voice unsteady but firm. Again and again, we pushed them, certain they would never retaliate, certain that they were too afraid of war. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. But we never stopped to ask ourselves what happens when a species that has spent its entire history mastering war finally chooses it. A sharp, bitter silence. Then, slowly, the Supreme Chancellor exhaled. The weight of inevitability pressed down on him, crushing the last remnants of his pride. This was not a war they could win. It had never been. It was always only a question of how long the humans had been willing to tolerate their arrogance before proving them wrong. Xylox turned toward the communication officer, his voice quieter than it had ever been. Send the transmission. The officer hesitated. Sir. Send it. A sharp intake of breath. A moment of hesitation. And then the chamber filled with the soft hum of activation as the signal was sent, beaming outward across the stars toward the advancing human fleet. A surrender. Unconditional. Final. The weight of the words seemed to drain the last of the Supreme Chancellor's strength. The war was over. But the consequences had only just begun. Moments later, the main holoscreen flickered back to life, and once more, the war chamber was greeted with the steady, unshaken gaze of General Alexander Mason. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He merely waited, watching, listening as Xylox spoke the words that sealed the fate of an empire. We yield. The Supreme Chancellor's voice was raw, stripped of all authority. The Galactic Empire surrenders to humanity. The chamber felt as if it had lost all oxygen. For a long moment, Mason did not speak. Then, finally, he exhaled. Smart choice. Xylox's throat constricted. What are your terms? Mason was silent for a moment, then leaned slightly forward. You're going to disband your fleets, he said. Permanently. Xylox tensed but did not object. You're going to dismantle every Imperial war factory, every weapons manufacturer, every military research division. A quiet ripple of unease moved through the council. Mason's voice remained steady. Your empire is done making war. Xylox let out a shaky breath. And what of the throne? Mason's expression did not change. You're stepping down. Xylox's fingers curled against the table. And if I refuse? Mason's voice was cold. Then I stopped being polite. There was no doubt in his words. No room for negotiation. Xylox inhaled sharply. And for the first time in his life, he nodded. The Galactic Empire would be no more. But the humans weren't done yet. Ryan Reynolds appeared on the transmission feed now, stepping into frame beside Mason, his usual smirk returning. Oh, and one more thing, Ryan said, folding his arms. We're going to need a little cultural adjustment. Xylox blinked. Cultural adjustment. Ryan grinned. That's right. Every Imperial-controlled world? Yeah, they're going to be required to implement a human cultural education program. A long pause. Xylox frowned. Meaning? Ryan shrugged. Mandatory lessons on Earth history. Full-scale distribution of human films and literature. And at least 3 hours of 80s and 90s cinema broadcast daily on every planet. The chamber was stunned into speechlessness. Ryan's grin widened. Oh, and we'll be sending over a mandatory playlist of human music. He tilted his head. Ever heard of Metallica? Xylox's fingers twitched. No. Ryan patted Mason on the shoulder. Oh, you will. The feed cut out. And in the heart of what was once the greatest empire in the galaxy, a single, collective realization began to set in. The humans had not just won. They had arrived. And they were going to make damn sure the galaxy never forgot it.